Welcome back, dear friends, to yet another class on the history of English language and literature. And we are discussing the Victorian poetry. In our previous classes, we have discussed about Alfred Lord Tennyson, Robert Browning and Matthew Arnold. And today, we shall discuss a very important topic. We shall discuss about the Pre-Raphaelites. We shall discuss about the Pre-Raphaelites. The Pre-Raphaelites or the Fleshy school of poetry. Please remember this, Pre-Raphaelite or the Fleshy school of poetry. Now, who were these Pre-Raphaelites? The Pre-Raphaelites were part of a brotherhood. The brotherhood was known as the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and it was established. The Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood was established in 1848. Now, this brotherhood, the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, consisted of a group of poets, painters and critics, who were influenced by the visual arts. They were influenced by the arts, visual arts. The poets of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood were immensely influenced by the paintings of the contemporary times. So, they are influenced by visual arts, paintings of the contemporary times. And primarily, this brotherhood was an artistic movement. Later on, it began to influence the literary movements as well. So, Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood was an artistic movement. Later on, it would have its influence in the literary movements as well. Now, the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood popularized the idea art for art's sake. Art for art's sake. The poets of the Pre-Raphaelite movement, they were revolting against the ugliness of contemporary life. The physical ugliness, the commercial and the economic ugliness, the moral ugliness, etc. Art for art's sake. So, they were revolting against the ugliness of the contemporary times. Naturally, we will ask a question, why they call themselves the Pre-Raphaelites Brotherhood. Pre means before. So, Pre-Raphaelite means before Raphael. So, before Raphaelites. The name Pre-Raphaelite stressed their admiration for the Italian art of the 15th century. Italian art of the times 1400 to 1499. Italian art of the 15th century. It was the art preceding the High Renaissance. Art preceding the High Renaissance. The High Renaissance started in 1500 and it would end in 1520 or so. So, the artists of the High Renaissance were Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael, etc. So, it was not the period of Raphael that fascinated them, but the art of the period prior to Raphael, the period prior to the High Renaissance. This is a period that fascinated them. So, they are known as the Pre-Raphaelites. They were influenced the art of the times prior to the High Renaissance. The founding members of the Pre-Raphaelite movements were William Holman Hunt, John Everett Millais, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, William Michael Rossetti. So, these were the four founding members of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. Now, this group began to publish a periodical called The Germ. Now, this periodical was edited by William Michael Rossetti initially, and it was published in 1850, and it had only 4 issues. So, the periodical published by the Pre-Raphaelites is The Germ. Having discussed something about the Pre-Raphaelites, their name, etc., we shall see what are some of the common features of this particular school of poetry. Common features of the poetry of the Pre-Raphaelites. This is important. The first one is their medieval outlook. The Pre-Raphaelites wanted to return to the simplicity of the medieval times. Medieval times means 5th to 15th century. They want to return to the chivalric and adventurous Middle Ages. They wanted to escape from the ugliness of the contemporary society and return to the Middle Ages. They popularized the idea, as I have already mentioned, art for art's sake. Art was their religion. Art was not for preaching morality. Art was not for reformation. Art was not for social changes. Art was for art's sake. They aimed at perfect form and finish in their poetic composition. So, they will return to the medieval times, fascination for the medieval times. The second characteristic is their vivid word pictures. Word pictures. The Pre-Raphaelites expressed minute details of what they saw. Express minute details, vivid. The third characteristic is sound sense. What is sound sense? The Pre-Raphaelite poetry is rich in melody. So third characteristic is the sound sense. The fourth characteristic is kinship with romantic poets. They showed more affiliation to romantic poets than the poets of the Victorian times. Their closeness to nature, their focus on realism and heavy symbolism made them closer to the romantics than the Victorian artists. So they were more close to the romantics. We cannot say that they completely neglected the contemporary times. They completely neglected the Victorian times. While keeping affinity to the romantics, they also responded to the contemporary state of the society as well. So they had more affinity to the romantic poets or the romantic times than the Victorian times. The next characteristic that we can remember, and it is quite important, is that the Pre-Raphaelite poetry was sensuous and impassioned. Sensuous. They were severely criticized for being too much concerned with the body. The body. The voluptuous bodies were part of their artistic works. So there were such obscenity in their works. A lot of depiction of obscenity in their works. So they were identified as the fleshy school of poetry. A lot of obscenity in their works were identified as fleshy school of poetry. Please remember this point, that is very important. The sixth characteristic is that the influences of the Pre-Raphaelites were strong on the visual arts than in writing. So they focused on the visual arts. It had less enduring impact on literature. It had less enduring impact on literature. Now we shall see one or two, three of the Pre-Raphaelite poets. Short description. The first one is D.G. Rossetti, Daniel Gabriel Rossetti, who lived from 1828 to 1888. Now, D.G. Rossetti was a painter and poet, and he was the eldest of the Pre-Raphaelite school of artists. Now D.G. Rossetti was quite unmodern and was not interested in the life of his time. He was not influenced by the London of the 19th century. So he was more influenced by the romantic period, not very much concerned about the Victorian times. Some of the important works of Rossetti are poems, which was written in 1870, ballads and sonnets, which was published in 1881. He was a successful ballad writer. The White Ship, Sister Helen, Eden Bower are some of his ballads. The House of Life is the sonnet that was written by D.G. Rossetti. One important work is the Blessed Damozel. The Blessed Damozel, he was criticized for the erotic elements of this particular and very popular poem, the Blessed Damozel. The second poet that we can remember is Algernon Charles Swinburne. Charles Swinburne, who lived from 1837 to 1909. Now, Swinburne was an important member of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. Though he lived in the Victorian period, it is generally considered that his genius belonged to the romantic stock. So he was more a genius, a romantic genius than the Victorian times. Some of his works are the following. A work that he published in 1865 is termed as Atlanta in Calydon. It was an English version of an ancient Greek tragedy, Atlanta in Calydon. Poems and Ballads, which he published in 1866. It is a second extraordinary book by Swinburne. In 1871, he would publish Ave Atque Vale. Now, it is an elegy by Swinburne to the 19th century French poet Charles Baudelaire. It expresses some of his most important poetic ideas and illustrates some of his characteristic poetic techniques. The rootless history of English literature has the following to state about Swinburne. It states in this manner: in his own life, Swinburne rebelled against established codes rather in the manner of Shelley. In religion, he was a pagan. In politics, he wanted to see the overthrow of established governments. In poetry, his works confirms collapse of conventional Victorian poetic standards. So the next poet whom we can mention is William Morris. He lived from 1834 to 1896. Now, William Morris was another important member of the Pre-Raphaelite movement. And some of the important works of William Morris are: one, The Life and Death of Jason, which was published in 1867, The Earthly Paradise, which was published in between 1868 and 1870. So my dear students, we are closing this short lecture on the Pre-Raphaelite school or the Fleshy school of poetry. It is a very often repeated question in the university examination to write about Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood or Pre-Raphaelite poetry or the Fleshy school of poetry. So for your assignment, please write a summary of the Pre-Raphaelite school of poetry, who they are, who are the Pre-Raphaelite who formed the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, why the name Pre-Raphaelite is given to them, why they adopted such a name, why they are called the Fleshy school of poetry, because of the depiction of so much of obscenity in their works. And most importantly, what are some of the characteristics of the Pre-Raphaelite poetry. So that is in short about the Pre-Raphaelite school of poetry. Thank you for your patient listening. Please stay safe, have a nice time and a joyful learning.